leading up to Martin Luther King's assassination. In that year, Dr. King faced unprecedented isolation owing to his strident criticisms of the Vietnam War, his heated debates with Democratic Party operatives and Black nationalists, and his headlong quest to mobilize the nation's truly disadvantaged. Abandoned by allies, fearing his death was near, King could only lament that my critics have never really known me, my commitment, or my calling. 50 years after his tragic assassination, we are perhaps subject to the same indictment. This forgetting began almost immediately. In one of the cruelest ironies of American history, the news that our nation's greatest champion of nonviolence had been murdered immediately unleashed the greatest spasm of mass violence and military suppression since the Civil War. Invoking a barbarous gospel of law and order, Americans ignored in large measure King's warning that social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention, and instead responded to the unrest by turning to a punitive ethos in everything from law enforcement to welfare. Meanwhile, political elites, scrambling to bolster their crumbling legitimacy, seized the occasion to refashion King's image into a new civic myth. Gone was the king who less than a month before his death proclaimed that if America does not use her vast resources of wealth to end poverty and make it possible for all of God's children to have the basic necessities of life, she too will go to hell. In his place emerged a comfortable symbol of racial reconciliation and national redemption. This amorphous ideals as diversity and service. The cost of this canonization is that King becomes a character too anodyne to provoke disagreement, let alone the revolution in values he called for in life. In recent years, thankfully, we've witnessed more strident attacks on this mythology. Yet while it has become a more familiar gesture to proclaim King's radicalism, such invocations often refuse to move much beyond reciting, as if a catechism, King's indictment of the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. If not cherry-picking quotes from King to attach out of context to existing agendas, there's often a self-satisfied contentment with general broadsides about racism's structural nature, war's unjustifiable scope, and poverty's unfortunate intractability. This, however, is a missed opportunity. What we hope to show here and in our work more broadly is that taking Martin King seriously as a public political philosopher provides critical insight into our contemporary plight and profound inspiration to our political imagination. But what is a public philosopher? At bottom, a public philosopher is someone who aims to bring the philosopher's practices of systematic reflection, relentless self-criticism, and radical questioning of the given into the broader public instead of cloistering away in academia and among the elite. The public philosopher is emphatically committed to argument in public about questions of value, meaning, and significance. How does power work in our society? What ideals or principles should govern our political arrangements, our treatment of one another? What matters and why? What may we hope for? What could justify our sacrifice? When practiced in a democratic spirit, public philosophy aims especially to persuade. This often involves not only careful analysis and argument, but also the development of new narratives, new vocabularies, and new descriptions of objects of public concern. A democratic public philosophy engages social movements in their practices with an eye not just toward clarification and critique, but also, when appropriate, solidarity. The ultimate aim is to help us realize and best live up to those ideals that are most worth our strivings and our sufferings. When we characterize King, therefore, as a public philosopher, these are the practices we mean to highlight and part of what we hope to gain from returning to his writings, speeches, and sermons 50 years later. One sermon that speaks especially to clearly to the mission of public philosophy is King's last Sunday morning sermon entitled "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." This address, delivered at the National Cathedral in Washington, in this address, King uses Washington Irving's story of Rip Van Winkle as a provocation. The one thing that we usually remember about the story, King reminds his audience, is that Rip Van Winkle slept 20 years. But, he continued, there's another point in that little story that is almost completely overlooked. When Rip Van Winkle leaves town to hike up the mountain where he eventually falls into his 20-year slumber, the sign at the local inn displayed a picture of King George III, ruler of England and her colonies. When he descends down the mountain 20 years later, however, Irving writes, the red coat was changed for one of blue and buff. A sword was held in the hand instead of a scepter. The head was decorated with a cocked hat, and underneath was painted in large characters, General Washington. For King, the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle is not merely that Rip slept 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. One of the great liabilities of life, King lamented, is that all too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. The metaphor of sleeping through a revolution and King's charge that we must remain awake finds important echoes in today's talk among activists and youth of staying woke. Yet while Dr. King could diagnose his age as an age of revolution, our challenge might be more aptly described as one of staying woke in a time of counter-revolution. Since King's death, our society has embraced vast wealth inequality and the largest prison population on earth. It has hollowed out the promise of social mobility and equal opportunity. Since 9/11, we appear entangled in endless and profligate war on multiple continents, sacrificing lives, health, and treasure to a militarism that has grown amorphous in scope and cynical in justification. At home, the backwash of militarism has given rise to unprecedented powers of surveillance and suppression and a resurgence of white nationalism. Soon, digital technology innovations and artificial intelligence will threaten even the service economy jobs that emerged to replace poorly the industrial jobs of the past. Cashiers, truck drivers, teachers, and paralegals are all being eaten, as Silicon Valley entrepreneurs put it, by software. And while they may come to find paid work elsewhere, what kind of work shall it be? What kind of collective bargaining will be available? What kind of distribution of income, assets, and power will these new titans of industry countenance? This is all to say nothing of King's central focus, racism, which we have never risen to confront in all its persistent and pervasive power. The corrosive impact of all of these developments, these counter-revolutionary developments, on democratic participation, civic solidarity, and racial resentment has been devastating. We find ourselves amidst gathering storms of authoritarianism, kleptocracy, racial chauvinism, and nihilism that threaten the future of democracy and the ideal of equality. We have come down from the mountaintop to find the pictures replaced and President Donald Trump on the tavern wall. Amidst such threats, King's moral clarity is akin to what the writer Ralph Ellison called a raft of hope. King's example of imagination and judgment might help us achieve Ellison's task of keeping afloat as we try to negotiate the snags and whirlpools that mark our nation's vacillating course toward and away from the democratic ideal. In what remains of my time, I want to talk more specifically about King's critical work on materialism, militarism, and racism, and about his political vision of how democratic insurgency might meet these challenges. For King, the question of eliminating poverty was central to justice. He condemned the unfairness that left vast numbers of Americans perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. His moral urgency on these questions stems in part from the sense that the failure to secure the fair value of our rights in an affluent and ostensibly democratic society expresses a special kind of contempt that he says is wasting and degrading human life. The contemporary tendency in our society, King decried, is to base our distribution on scarcity, which has vanished, and to compress our abundance into the overfed mouths of the middle and upper classes until they gag with superfluity. In light of this tendency, which has only increased since King's death, King hoped that the civil rights movement would evolve into what he called a challenge to a system that has created miracles of production and technology to create justice. In remaining awake through a great revolution, King puts the point in a way that's worth quoting at length. One day we will have to stand before the God of history, and we will talk in terms of things we've done. Yes, we will be able to say we built gargantuan bridges to span the seas. We built gigantic buildings to kiss the skies. Yes, we made our submarines to penetrate oceanic depths. It seems that I can hear the God of history saying that was not enough. But I was hungry, and ye fed me not. I was naked, and ye clothed me not. Tragically, such conditions still obtain. While over $600 billion are publicly budgeted for military expenditure, over 40 million Americans live below the poverty line, with roughly 19 million living in deep poverty. Well over 1 million Americans survive on less than $2 per day. Blacks remain overrepresented among the US poor, and even though nationwide black unemployment has reached new lows, the prevalence of casual labor, the erosion of unions, and corporate consolidation all mean that wages have remained stubbornly slow to rise. Worse, all of these statistics still manage to underestimate the depth of poverty because they exclude the roughly 2.3 million Americans who are incarcerated. Despite our sitting president's rhetoric of American carnage, Congress has commandeered the machinery of government to focus primarily on increasing military funding and lowering tax rates for large corporations and the wealthy, even going so far as to give tax breaks for $50,000 private school tuitions and multi-million-dollar inheritances. Meanwhile, legislatures across the country target social services and public goods for elimination and privatization by decrying their supposed wastefulness. For Martin Luther King, to turn a blind eye towards such inequality and permit necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few was to become cold and conscienceless. In other words, the demand and desire for luxury and affluence are less questions of desert than of decadence. These failures of reciprocity, fairness, and decency raise fundamental questions of justice and civic duty. King's declaration that a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death is not merely a pacifist lament. In a society marked by structural injustices like ghetto poverty and deep inequality, this claim raises the unsettling implication that such a society may no longer legitimately command the obedience or affirmation of its most disadvantaged members. This is in part what justified King's latter advocacy of mass civil disobedience in pursuit of social justice and the mass refusal of the Vietnam draft. The scale of civil disobedience he hoped to direct in his Poor People's Campaign was in part about refusing as a matter of integrity and dignity, self-respect and solidarity, democracy and justice, to cooperate willingly with structural unfairness and arbitrary power. Underscoring his critique of liberals who disavowed such contentious action, he denounced those who treated the law itself as the reality of the law. One could not assume, King rightly argued, that judicial decisions in favor of civil rights had created a mechanism that needed only orderly and smooth tending for the painless accomplishment of change. The recurrent lesson of American history was that civil rights and equality were perpetually vulnerable to evasion without vigilant citizen action from associations like churches, unions, activist groups, and the like. But why are the energies to redress economic ills so lacking and the coalitions necessary so fractured? As King never ceased to mention, economic injustice was exacerbated and enabled in part by racism. Yet in the spirit of staying awake, it is important to note here that King did not inflate racism to explain all racial disparities. He understood that such inequalities, including vulnerability to homicide, are outcomes of many phenomena that interact with but cannot be reduced to racism, including technology, political economy, and cultural patterns. As early as the mid-1960s, for example, King presciently warned that automation and capital investments in efficiency would dislocate middle-class jobs, stagnate wages, and devastate unions. The burdens created because of historical disadvantage and lasting discrimination would fall on poor black folks most severely, but the broader social dislocations would be shared, making possible, at least in theory, political alliances and more promising social policy horizons than the dead ends of go-it-alone black politics or elegiac laments about the impossibility of overcoming white supremacy. Yet in order to overcome racism and build these alliances, King argued that we needed to understand how racism worked. He thought that the prescription for the cure rests with an accurate diagnosis of the disease. He argued that racism is deeply entangled with what he called irrational fears of losing economic and social standing, of contamination and proximity, of an unknown future, and above all, of revenge and retaliation. The desire to escape or somehow avoid this fear, King argues, generates strange psychoses and peculiar cases of paranoia, and political resistance must take into account the fundamental irrationality of many of our opponents. In one of his erudite dissections of racism, King writes that it seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually reaching out for some rationalization to clothe their acts in the garments of righteousness. He noted that it was in large part the attempt to give moral sanction to a profitable system of slavery that gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy. A crucial piece of this doctrine is that non-whites are incapable of contributing meaningfully to future social progress. Such ideas echoed and reinforced in many respects Jim Crow and colonialism alike. Segregationists denied that blacks had the cognitive abilities or character to vote or hold office. The presumed incapacity of the so-called darker races abroad for self-government became grist for the denial of rights at home. Richard Nixon, for example, suggested that racial progress in the US would always founder on blacks' inherent deficiencies, citing the evidence of impoverished Africa. There has never in history been an adequate black nation, Nixon's chief of staff reports him saying, and they are the only race of which this is true. This sentiment has found its latest proponent in the White House, who likewise referred to Haiti, El Salvador, and Africa in derogatory terms, calling for restriction on immigration from these countries. And I encourage you all to read Kojik's courageous statement denouncing those comments. The contempt contained in such utterances seek to reduce whole peoples and nations to misery alone, and it denies our complicity in their struggles. Most cruelly, it hopelessly tries to deny that potential for creativity and genius, which even oppression and hardship cannot truly extinguish. Pulling out of its obscurity and stripping it of its rationalizations lies in the confidence that it can be changed. But can we actually produce such systemic change? King admitted that racism in America was not just an occasional departure from the norm on the part of a few bigoted extremists, but a congenital deformity. Yet equally real, King says, is a democratic spirit that has opposed racial domination and other hierarchies throughout American history. His unapologetic identification with this spirit is a gauntlet. It divides, both then and now, those who see the struggle for racial democracy as a series of exemplary strivings, partial victories, and genuine missed opportunities, and those who see the ultimate essence and fate of the American racial order as having been permanently cast long ago. In a sense, King's challenge is that our fates are not determined, but dependent on our own ability to act ethically, courageously, and effectively. It is without question that we face existential challenges of climate change, nuclear weaponry, war and terrorism, and wealth inequality. Yet the institutions that exercise the most power over these outcomes remain insulated from democratic action. If the rage and resentment of this powerlessness is not to be exploited by demagogues and reactionaries, it must be channeled into coordinated, enduring social movements. If it is not to degenerate into apathy and alienation, these movements must force electoral, economic, and other reckonings with these threats while fostering respect for our shared garment of destiny. Further, such movements must include the truly disadvantaged themselves. After the 1965 Watts riot, for example, King spent much of the next year in Chicago, moving his family into a tenement apartment to dramatize unjust conditions in northern cities. Declaring Chicago the opening front in a struggle to end slums, King attacked residential segregation, poverty, consumer exploitation, joblessness, and government malfeasance. Since this campaign, it has become common to declare King's efforts in Chicago a failure, but I think such broadsides miss the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's subtle legacy of supporting the political agency and potential power of the poor. King held against critics that even those presently involved in the underground economy or in gangs or in poverty could become vital partners in struggle. Transgressing the class norms of respectability and the conventional prohibitions incumbent upon a Southern Baptist preacher, King and SCLC staff recruited gang members in the dive bars and street corners of Chicago. He even invited gang members into his home, engaging them in long, patient debates about injustice, anger, and the politics of nonviolence into the early hours of the morning. These efforts, it must be admitted, were not always successful, yet they remain inspiring, especially considering the alternatives of antagonism and apathy. Members of gangs from Chicago joined King in the 1966 Mississippi Freedom March and in open housing marches in Chicago that summer. This experience helped convince King that despite the all too easy association of these young men with violence, neither they nor nonviolence should be written off for the future. This faith in the political and moral agency of the oppressed, which connects King's work from Montgomery's bus boycott through Chicago all the way to here in Memphis with the sanitation workers, remains a challenge to both the apathetic resignation and technocratic arrogance that constrain our political imagination today. Such organizing is not afraid to ask with King, how shall we turn the ghettos into a vast school? How shall we make every street corner a forum, and in doing so, strive to rescue American democracy from its present course toward catastrophe? King was hopeful, but not blind to the difficulty and cost of these aspirations. Such movements will face repression, scorn, prison, and sacrifice. Racism will threaten solidarity, violence will injure our faith in cooperation, and inequality will continue to breed its rationalizations. But when threats are existential, retreat and accommodation are simply avenues to self-destruction. As we scour the ruins of our present for archives of resistance and exemplars of struggle, we must not lose sight of the significance of America's most peculiar radical and his enduring intellectual and political challenge. King's memory calls on us to think and argue in public about how to face the crises of our present and experiment and interrogate the broadest range of nonviolent coercive powers at our disposal. Our very survival, King wrote, depends on our ability to stay awake, to adjust to new ideas, to remain vigilant, and to face the challenge of change. The spirit of King is most alive when we embrace these challenges and endeavor with courage, humility, and a sense of the great sacrifices ahead to shape a new world out of divine dissatisfaction with injustice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Terry, for an inspiring and thoughtful reflection on how a great thinker, a great leader, a man of great courage is relevant for us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Tommy Shelby, who is himself a public philosopher of great courage. Professor Tommy Shelby is a Caldwell-Titcomb professor in the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, where he has taught since 2000. He earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Shelby is the author of Dark Ghettos, Injustice, Dissent, and Reform, which won the 2016 Book Award from the North American Society for Social Philosophy. He's also the author of We Who Are Dark, The Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity. He collaborated with Professor Brandon M. Terry on the book To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King, Jr. And I would like to point out that Professor Shelby's book, Dark Ghettos, is really a courageous, thoughtful, and provocative defense of the Black poor that has the potential to really reshape the way in which justice is understood and executed in inner city neighborhoods. Professor Shelby.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivers, for that generous introduction. I thank Eugene Rivers for inviting me and letting me have opportunity to address you all. Thank you to Bishop Blake for hospitality and leadership, and thank you all for coming here today to discuss these ideas with us. It's been a great pleasure working with Professor Brandon Terry on this project on King's political philosophy. We really wanted to try to bring out the broad range of his thought both in putting him in a tradition of political philosophy that goes back for millennia, and to bring him into the present and to show the relevance of his ideas, the subtlety of which is often overlooked, to see the relevance for our moment today. Martin Luther King Jr. said 2 developments marked the end of the first phase of the civil rights movement and the start of a new black freedom struggle. The first was the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The second was the emergence of riots in black ghettos, particularly the destructive uprising that began on August 11th, 1965 in the neighborhood of Watts. As he tells us, quote, "The explosion in Watts reminded us all that the northern ghettos are the prisons of forgotten men." The Black freedom movement, King insisted, must turn north to attack the problems of the ghetto, and as usual, King backed up his words with action. My colleague Brandon's already mentioned he moved with his family to a West Side slum in Chicago. The aims of the largely Southern Civil Rights Campaign were to end racist brutality, to abolish Jim Crow ordinances, and to establish an effective right to vote. The Voting Rights Act then brought to a close the struggle for minimally decent treatment for blacks. The new phase, however, aimed to realize economic equality. We must, King argued, move beyond ending humiliation to ending poverty, prohibiting labor exploitation, and creating greater economic fairness. The 2 phases, in King's conception, are part of one long struggle, because racial injustice and economic injustice are, as he says, inseparable twins. King thought the ghettos persist not only because of racism, but also because of past and ongoing economic injustices. Accordingly, King called for a civil rights labor alliance. The problems of labor are also black problems, because the vast majority of blacks are ordinary workers. Together, workers of with other races, working with those of other races, blacks can create just economic conditions, both in the United States and elsewhere. So what I want to do is dive down a little bit into his economic philosophy, to the particular principles. I'm going to mention 4, but I think bring out the various dimensions of his conception of economic justice. One of King's most basic principles is that no one should be forced to live in poverty while others live in luxury. King thought that knowingly allowing some to endure poverty when one has enormous wealth exhibits callous indifference to human suffering, and so is a sign of bad character. But he also regarded this situation as a threat to the dignity of the poor, and so an injustice. Indifference to human suffering is obviously wrong. We don't really need a complicated theory of egalitarian justice to condemn it. Yet this kind of indifference, when it's widespread in a society, is a moral indictment of that society, and not just of the particular individuals within it. Such poverty is unnecessary, given the resources and technology available, and so is, King thought, barbaric. Given that economic impoverishment is gratuitous suffering, the refusal of the affluent to share their wealth with the poor is not just selfish, but actually demonstrates that some value profit and property more than they do persons. And it is therefore a serious moral vice, not to mention unchristian. Focusing explicitly on the ghetto poor in the United States, King emphasized that black ghetto residents often feel humiliated to be living in such squalor, while just blocks away, others, mostly white, live in luxury and engage in conspicuous consumption. Although whites lack an intimate knowledge of ghetto poverty, ghetto denizens are fully aware of the opulence just beyond their reach. And it's this knowledge that makes them miserable and often, unfortunately, bitter. However, King needs to help us understand, I think, here why these feelings of misery are rooted in reasonable resentment and not just, as some people might contend, irrational envy. It's not immediately obvious why the poor's claim on greater resources is stronger because some people have great wealth. So if dire threats to human well-being can be removed without great sacrifice, well then surely such action should be taken, right? Even by those who aren't rich. And so perhaps all King had in mind here is that opulence is a sign that a society is capable of eradicating poverty, yet doesn't do it. But I think there might be something more to this principle than this. King thought persons who are poor can't maintain their dignity, and by this he meant, in this context, their sense of intrinsic worth and equal civic standing in the presence of great wealth. Allowing one's fellow citizens to languish in poverty communicates to the poor that they lack inherent equal worth and is therefore a kind of insult to them. In what is supposed to be a society of equals, a democracy, it is a public expression of contempt to act in such a way that suggests that others' urgent needs have less moral weight than one's own access to extravagant objects of desire. The poor, naturally and appropriately, see such attitudes as an attack on their status as equal citizens. Moreover, workers cannot sustain self-esteem and morale if their market position suggests that their abilities are practically worthless to others in society. Poverty stigmatizes the jobless in a society that measures worth, human worth, in terms of how much money each person can earn or has. Dignity can be restored or maintained, he thought, only if each is widely recognized as entitled to either a job or basic income. A sense of equal standing will be secure for everyone only when no one's basic worth is measured in terms of their labor market competitiveness. A widely recognized right to basic income establishes these conditions. For what it does is publicly conveys that everyone is entitled to live a decent life, even if the labor market won't reward their efforts with a living wage. When thinking about economic justice, King also invoked a second principle. Individuals should be equipped with adequate material means so they can take full advantage of their formal freedoms. Now, while mere formal liberties and opportunities do provide some protection from threats to dignity, they are of limited value to the poor. So even with discriminatory barriers removed, one can't move to an integrated neighborhood without money for rent or mortgage payments. So real freedom and opportunity has to be accompanied by sufficient means to take advantage of them. So here's King. Negroes must not only have the right to go into any establishment open to the public, but they must also be absorbed into our economic system in such a manner that they can also afford to exercise that right. Now, this principle rests on a distinction that King sometimes made between an abstract right and a concrete right. So mere legal recognition of equal citizenship, even when it's adequately enforced, is not sufficient for social justice, because it doesn't enable each person to enjoy the privileges of equal citizenship. Abstract rights, though, even if they're codified in law, they still allow for second-class citizenship. Now, King comes closest, I think, to explicitly egalitarian concerns when discussing employment compensation. So he says things like, the fruits of labor should be shared equitably, with labor and capital on equal footing. Now, I think it's fair to say that the exact content and scope of this principle isn't as precise as one might like, and it's somewhat difficult to know exactly what it might mean in practice. What we would probably need to know here is a kind of an account of what grounds property rights, which I don't think King quite gives us. And without that, we wouldn't have a fully usable standard for deciding when we have what constitutes a fair wage or what constitutes a fair profit margin. Now, we do know, relying on King's first two principles, that full-time workers should not be paid poverty-level wages. So King says things like, quote, labor needs a wage-hour bill which puts a firm floor under wage scales. But of course, this is compatible with capital taking the lion's share of the benefits of economic cooperation. So it doesn't really quite help us fully understand what the call for equity in this context calls for. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, King believed everyone was entitled to basic necessities regardless of whether they are employed or own capital. King did emphasize the importance of building and strengthening labor organizations. So what we might do is conclude that fair employment compensation is whatever union representatives and management agree to when labor's right to organize is concrete and not merely abstract. So perhaps when capital exploits labor, this amounts to taking advantage of workers' weak bargaining position and blocking their attempts to strengthen it. Yet King makes it clear that the power of labor organizations is needed in this case because the owners of capital operate not from goodwill or from reciprocity, but solely from the motive of profit. Increasing the bargaining position of unions is merely a concession to this political reality. It's an effective means to acquire equitable compensation for workers, given that capitalists are too often inclined to withhold it. So King, I think, must have thought here that there was an independent standard for workplace distributive justice, and maybe that's something we might discuss what exactly that principle might be. I think we gain some insight into King's overall conception of economic justice by considering a final principle. It goes like this: productivity gains should benefit all and not just the owners of capital. Now, as things now stand, capitalism, given how it sort of spurs technological innovation, it also has a tendency to create unemployment and underemployment. Automation makes some workers' labor less valuable and sometimes even unnecessary. Yet joblessness is often interpreted or a lack of ability, when in fact it is a byproduct of our economic system and of our increasing reliance on machines and production. The market demand for efficiency and low labor costs pushes many people into joblessness and into insecure employment, and so into poverty. The purchasing power of the average worker has not kept pace with gains of productivity, and it's this situation that King thought justified organizing labor. Why? So workers can bargain for a greater share of the benefits of economic cooperation. It also justifies guaranteeing either a basic income or a job for those whose labor technology is rendered less valuable. And it justifies creating public sector jobs when private sector employment is insufficient. And finally, it justifies dramatically expanding leisure time for working people, as technology reduces the need for burdensome and unrewarding labor. Now, King argued that while technology is the product of human labor and imagination and ingenuity, and so, of course, something that we all should be proud of as human beings, but within a capitalist economy, it can be a tyrannical force in the lives of everyday working people. And so it must therefore be brought under democratic control and used to promote human welfare and not utilized solely for profit or war. Now, to the disappointment of some of his radical critics, King never advocated the complete abolition of capitalism. He was still, I would say, a radical when it comes to economic justice. To achieve economic justice, King believed that there had to be a revolution of values. And this revolution must ultimately transcend the values of both capitalism and communism. As he said, relying on here terminology drawn from the philosopher Hegel, quote, "The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism." Now, King's opposition to communism is really quite consistent throughout his writings and speeches. So he insisted that communism is antithetical to Christianity and the faith's most formidable rival, he said. He rejected historical materialism, that's Karl Marx's theory of historical change, on the grounds that it denied the efficacy of moral thought and action in radical social change. Historical materialism makes no place for God, whom King believed to be the sustainer of life and the foundation of value. Materialist philosophy treats religion as an ideological delusion rooted in fear and ignorance. It treats humans as self-sufficient when in fact they need God. The Marxist conception of human nature and of history made it impossible for King as a Christian to embrace its philosophy. Yet King also had secular objections to communism. So, for instance, he regarded Marxists as moral relativists. King, like a lot of secular philosophers, didn't accept moral relativism, but rather regarded justice and peace, among other values, as fundamental and everlasting values of the highest importance. He thought that communists tended to advocate revolutionary violence, but he rejected the idea that good ends can justify violence or deceit as means. He pointed out that communists also often reject liberal democratic values. They have a tendency to deny that liberty is of paramount value, that it is a paramount value. They often treat individuals as mere instruments for revolutionary change. And communists value the state and the ideal of a class of society above the individual and above personal autonomy. Though communists believe the state will eventually become obsolete in a socialist utopia, in the meantime, individuals are just generally treated as mere means for abolishing capitalism, with no claim to any liberties that might interfere with the success of the revolutionary project. Now, King maintained with other liberal thinkers that individuals have inherent and inalienable rights, including a claim to participate in collective self-government as equals. Freedom, here in this case understood as our capacity for rational deliberation and choice, is what makes us human and what gives us dignity. And so echoing a principle that's familiar from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, King insisted, quote, "To deprive man of freedom is to relegate him to the status of a thing, rather than elevate him to the status of a person. Man must never be treated as a means to the end of the state, but always as an end within himself." Nonetheless, King praised Marx for being a champion of the poor, the exploited, and the dispossessed. He believed the communist movement was ultimately rooted in an abiding concern for social justice, and is itself a protest against injustice. Communists oppose racism, and they seek to realize a classless society. So despite the fundamental flaws in communism, King was adamantly opposed to suppressing it through war. We have to defeat communism, he thought, by ending the injustices it is a response to and that it's nourished by. Indeed, King insisted there is truth in its collectivist spirit. We should seek to unite its concern for community and the least advantaged with respect for individual rights and free enterprise. King criticized capitalism too, maintaining that it created not only immense economic inequality, but also superfluous wealth and degrading forms of poverty. He condemned the fact that in America, 0.1% of the population controls almost 50% of the wealth, maybe worse now. The driving ethos of capitalism fosters indifference to the suffering of others. Given market dynamics and the centrality of the profit motive, capitalism rewards a win-at-all-cost competitive spirit and narrowly self-interested ambition. It also encourages us to evaluate everything, including the worth of other people, in terms of commercial values. But I think King, he seems to have thought that capitalism could be reformed, perhaps it needed to be radically reformed in order to avoid these consequences. So he would say things like, quote, "We can work within the framework of our democracy to make for a better distribution of wealth." So although King is a radical when it comes to economic justice, it would be misleading, I think, to describe him as a socialist. Though he called for a fair distribution of wealth, he didn't criticize private ownership of productive assets as inherently unjust, nor did he argue for the nationalization of finance. Rather, he simply didn't think that such private wealth should be concentrated in the hands of a few, which of course would give them inordinate and dangerous power over the lives of others. And where do we go from here? King did invoke Psalm 24, which says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." By taking the point of doing so was to emphasize that we should use natural resources in a way that would garner God's favor, which means not wasting them on the consumption of luxuries and being compassionate and generous toward those in need. And this would not, it seems, require the public ownership of all natural resources, productive technology, and banks. So I think it's probably best to describe King as a social democrat, even a radical social democrat. His vision embraced elements from capitalism and from socialism. He favored a mixed economy, a combination of private and public ownership within which wealth and income are equitably shared under democratic governance. Labor rights are robust, and no one is forced to live without basic economic security. So let me close. So deeply disadvantaged black neighborhoods are still with us. including right here in Memphis. We have yet to abolish the ghetto as a site of racial and economic subordination. Discrimination in employment and unfair housing practices remain a problem. None of King's 4 principles that I've described have been fully realized in the United States. There is still enormous poverty in the midst of great invisible opulence. There's approximately 15% of Americans live below the federal poverty line, and more than 1/3 of all black children, and of course, if you all know, some 27% of people in Memphis are poor. The black unemployment rate is double the white unemployment rate and has been for decades, and the jobless rate among the ghetto poor is even higher. The federal minimum wage does not ensure that a full-time worker can raise a family outside of poverty. Labor organizations will limited power because unionization rates are low, and right-to-work laws make it harder for workers to bargain for fair compensation. Even though technological innovation and productive efficiency have soared since King's death, the real wages of the average worker have remained flat. And it would be an understatement to say that we have not transcended traditional capitalist values. The war on poverty ultimately yielded to an attack on welfare as an entitlement. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, commonly just called welfare reform, it basically abolished unconditional income support for poor families. There are now five-year lifetime limits on receiving federal welfare support, and this support is conditional on recipients meeting work requirements. Notwithstanding this contraction of the welfare state, there is no entitlement to a public sector job for those who can find decent work in the private sector. Under these conditions, I take it that dignity is threatened, equal citizenship is for many an abstract right at best, the abolition of the ghetto remains a distant dream, here now more than 50 years after the Watts riot. So the question for us, then, is whether ghettos will still be a reality 15 years from now. And of course, that largely depends on what we do now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Shelby, for the challenge and the application of Dr. King's thinking on the importance of labor organizing and his opposition to unrestrained wealth. To comment on the remarks of both Professor Terry and Professor Shelby, we have Professor David Daniels, who is, among other things, a bishop, an auxiliary bishop in the Church of God in Christ. He's also the Henry Luce Winter Professor of World Christianity at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. He received the Bachelor of Arts from Bowdoin College, the Master of Divinity from Yale University, and his PhD in Church History from Union Theological Seminary. He has lectured at various colleges and seminaries in the United States, including Butler University and Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, at the Bosse Institute in Switzerland, and in Nigeria, Senegal, and Canada. Among many other publications, he has just recently published an article, Economic Democracy, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black Church Tradition in the current edition of the Telos magazine. Professor Daniels.
I want to join my co-panelists in thanking the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Union, and also thanking the Church of God in Christ, especially my presiding bishop, Bishop Charles Edward Blake. Dr. Shelby and Dr. Tommy Shelby and Dr. Brandon Terry advances our analyses of the plight of African Americans. Dr. Terry reintroduces us to the radical king. But before I proceed further, let me remind us that we are meeting in Mason Temple, an edifice that is named, as Bishop Blake said, after Bishop Charles Harrison Mason, the founder of the Church of God in Christ. Of importance to this conference, it could be that Mason could be called a pro-labor bishop. In 1931, he called for an interstate bus boycott. I believe it might be one of the first calls for an interstate bus boycott in the United States at that time. He called for an interstate bus boycott because bus companies refused to hire African Americans. And it just so happened that one of the regional bus companies was headquarters here in Memphis. So he wasn't talking about an opponent in a distant land, but he was talking about a neighbor. But not only did he call for an interstate bus boycott in 1931, but his congregation, Temple Church of God in Christ, as well as other congregations associated with the denomination, hosted union meetings. They were able to gather there in safety in order to be able to address the issues of their members. And during his lifetime, this building itself, Mason Temple, served as a place of civil rights rallies. So maybe he could be called then a pro-labor bishop. Dr. Tommy Shelby reminds us that King called for labor and capital to be treated on equal footing to advance economic justice. I want to talk about that more in my remarks. And I want to sort of frame the beginning of that by following up on Dr. Brandon Terry's question, how does power work in our society? Or let me narrow it down, how does power work in our economy? Dr. Martin Luther King explored the topic of economic justice throughout his public career. Matter of fact, his first comment occurs around 1951, 1952, as he's a doctoral student. And so therefore, economic justice was not really a concern of his during the 1960s, but he was concerned about it even before he became a public individual. Economic democracy, which is a term I'd like us to latch on to, was a term that he introduced in 1961. And I want to offer that economic democracy frames the way he, and I believe we, should talk about economic justice. I wonder what would happen if economic democracy was reintroduced into our public discourse and became part of our public policy. Economic democracy possesses a just economy, marked by those basic things: a living wage, adequate health care, decent housing, a solid education, and you can go on. It also provides what he calls, quote, a better distribution of wealth, unquote. And it demonstrates what he calls a moral use of capitalism. Central to King's economic democracy was the need, again, as Dr. Shelby said, to have a parity between the interests of labor and, the interests of capital and the interests of labor. According to King, while the economy was reformable, it lacked in itself the capacity to reform itself. It lacked the capacity to correct itself because it lacked the capacity to perform by itself in a moral way. The U.S. economy, by design, privileges capital. It privileges the capital sector. It privileges corporations. The capital sector also possesses what is described as a disproportionate amount of power to influence the economy in its favor. So some of you can guess where then this will go. Because the exploitation of labor is the mark of an unrestrained and unchecked capital. The goal of economic democracy is what he calls economic security for all Americans, in which workers are treated with dignity and afforded a decent wage. To achieve economic security for all Americans, King advocates, as Dr. Shelby has already said, full employment and a federally guaranteed minimum income. Some of you who watch the news know that the experiment is already being tried in Finland. They're trying with a pilot group. I think there's a couple of other countries that are trying this concept of a guaranteed minimum wage. Why can't we try it? In order to create economic security by countering the economy's orientation to benefit the capital sector, labor had to be organized and mobilized to serve as a counterbalance to the privileged capital sector. Without such a counterbalance, working people will continue to be underserved by the economy. However, according to King, more than organized labor is needed to serve as a counterbalance to the capital sector. We need organized and mobilized sectors of citizens, of consumers, of civil rights groups, of tenant groups, of all different kinds of sectors within our civil society in order to provide pressure to the federal government to move towards economic justice and erect a just economy. I wonder if there's a place for the sector of black congregations, as well as all congregations, to serve as this counterbalance, not merely to agitate for a minimum wage, but to agitate for a counterbalance towards the capital sector. The electorate stands as this counterbalance to King, to this unrestrained capitalist interest. It needs, as well as these other entities within the civil society, to pressure legislators to pass legislation that secures and expands prosperity for all. Without economic democracy, then with an economic democracy, American citizens come first. American citizens have precedence over capital. The citizenry then provides the oversight and through legislation guides the economy towards economic justice. Without introducing a viable counterbalance to the power of the capital sector in the economy, we'll end up with tax programs like we currently have. Large proportions of the society, especially the working poor and the poor of all races, will be harmed by the economy. But in addition to serving as a counterbalance to the capital sector, in addition to redistributing the power between labor and capital, the parity between the interests of capital and labor plays a role in fostering what he would call a conscience within the capital sector. Corporations need to have a conscience. They need to be socially responsible. And when the right of labor is balanced by when the right of capital is balanced by the right of labor, the right of capital can begin to be pressured into having a conscience. In a democratic economy, the economy operates humanely, productively, and profitably when the recognition of the right of capital is on par with the right of labor, according to King. In a democratic economy, we address the structural causes of poverty rather than poverty as a symptom. It's not merely trying to get a person a job, it's trying to change the economy so that everybody has a job. An economic democracy opens up new horizons, and they extend the frontiers of democracy towards a just society. So I join Dr. Shelby. Maybe it's best to describe it as social democrat, or maybe as Dr. Cornel West says, calls it democratic capitalist. Whatever the term is, we need to find a way that the citizens of this country have a role to play in the way the economy develops in this country for the good of all.
I'd like to thank all three of our scholars and to give you a chance. It's been a rare privilege for us to hear from some of the leading minds in the country. Normally, we have to go to Harvard and to McCormick Theological Seminary in order to hear from these leaders, these thought leaders. And now you have an opportunity to ask some questions. I'd like to take the privilege of the chair and pose a question first to any of you. Professor Terry and Professor Daniels, you've argued for the need for minimum income, guaranteed minimum income. And Professor Shelby, you've talked about the importance of labor being treated as the equivalent, with equivalent power to capital. Yet the thing that seems to be challenging this is the fact that elections in the United States are largely bought and paid for. And that it is the wealthy who decides who will, and that politicians are well aware of this. In fact, there's research that shows that it's what rich people prefer in terms of policy that gets enacted, even when the vast majority of the population wants the opposite policy measures. Do you have suggestions, insights from your reading of Dr. King or from your own research, your own work, about how we move forward with advancing the things that you have called for in the current political context? Thank you, Professor.
I wish I knew the answer to that. Maybe start with the question of principle and maybe think about what the practice might be. I take it that we didn't talk that much about this aspect of it, but I think King, part of the reason why he wanted wealth to be widely distributed and not concentrated in the hands is because of concerns of democracy. You can't really have a true democracy where people are really equals in a society and all having a say in what the rules are going to be, what the laws are going to be, if some just have enormous wealth, because they basically will always find a way to use their resources and connections to shape policy in their direction. So part of the point of having wealth widely distributed and having a progressive tax policy is to actually create the conditions for democratic practice, for democratic living and democratic governance. I mean, lots of people have, I mean, you have to work on many fronts. I think, as King would always say, you work on many fronts. Some of these things have to do with things our colleague, Larry Lessig, has been emphasizing for a long time as a law school professor, about the ways in which you have to move away from a conception of corporations as persons and as having a kind of treating them like they're on par with individual people, right? And unless you sort of attack that whole idea, and including the idea of a fiduciary duty as the only duty that corporations have, like the duty to just make their stockholders money, if that's the only responsibility corporations have, then we're pretty much doomed, right? So I think that those sorts of attacks, but those go to pretty fundamental features of our society, indeed to the Constitution itself.
Indeed. Professor Terry, did you want to?
Sure. One of the other things that I think Dr. King is trying to underscore with the appeal to basic minimum income is this idea that because the law and the courtroom can't be the only avenue of contesting injustice or arbitrary power. I mean, this is one of the big points about unions, right, is that you don't want to have to go through a long litigation process to receive fair arbitration of a dispute in a short period of time, right? And this is why, I've written a piece for a New Labor Forum, and partly about this is just that for a lot of people in the present age, unions are actually the best vehicle to redress instances of racial discrimination. This way you can get immediate redress. You don't have to have $1 million to hire a lawyer and these sorts of things. So one of the things that basic minimum income might allow people to do is to be able to contest their employer, right? Because you don't have the threat of starvation hanging over you for mistreatment. I also want to say, and this is the thing that I think Dr. King gets to toward the end of his life, but it also shows that that the society values things that aren't market-based labor, right? So child rearing, taking care of the elderly, the sick, right? Things that often fall upon women to do in our society, but are not compensated or treated fairly, in part because they're associated with women, and we still have a deep problem with sexism in this society. So, this is the thing Dr. King got to toward the end of his life, but that's a crucial piece of it.
Excellent, thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Speak up, please.
Sure. We should just repeat the question. So the question was all about the upcoming Supreme Court case about whether unions will be able to get mandatory dues paid from any of the employees at an organized shop. And as many of you know, particularly those of you who asked me, there's just it's likely to come down, if the conservative element on the court has its way, it's likely to come down in a crippling blow. And so the question is, what do we do? What would Dr. King do to try to rally people who are not union members to address that issue? I'll say briefly, I think this goes back to the kind of thing I was talking about at the end, when he says, how do we make every street corner a forum, right? How do we create spaces of public contestation and debate where currently there are none? And I think this is why a gathering like this is really important, to bring people from ASME in conversation with people at COGIC. Those kinds of cross-pollination efforts